the building. Okay, we are live, Chloe, after minor difficulties to start with. Thank you so much for joining. I've really loved your podcast, as you know, and I know we've just been having a bit of a geek out, so I appreciate you coming today for us to continue having a chat.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to chat with you again.
I can't believe it was a year ago, so there's lots that we need to catch up on. But I'll kick off questions while we're waiting for everybody else to pop theirs in the chat. So one of the things I realized when we were listening to your podcast the other day is you're in this startup crazy world as well as kind of Lab 17. So you're kind of always trying to balance at least two different things. But also, as we know in startups, and we talked about, you've kind of got this to-do list, but you've also got stuff coming at you the entire time. How do you kind of balance work out what's important and what's urgent?
Yes, I was thinking about this one, and I've only been within the startup scale-up world for the last 4 or 5 years. And I was like, oh yeah, I guess this is something that I need to consider day to day. For me, I've got my to-do list, which is my piece of paper, and literally every time I have a conversation with someone, if I have an action point, I have to write it down. That's just kind of my go-to on a day-to-day basis. What I've started to do more recently as well with my team is actually block out time for ambiguity. So throughout the week, we are booking time in with candidates. We've got our catch-ups with our hiring managers. We've got to go through applicants, all those things. But sometimes you can let all of that control your calendar. What we've started to do is actually book out 30 minutes in the morning, 30 minutes in the afternoon, or hour sessions, or just for sourcing, just to make sure that we've actually got time to be proactive as well. I think another thing is, and actually this is probably the most important thing, is just goal setting. So at the Lab 17, we set goals every Monday, and this is what we anticipate or plan for the week. And this is always best case scenario. So usually, you know, if we've got a candidate going to offer, it's like, yes, offer out, and then a stretch would be that offer accepted, because also there's a little bit of uncertainty around that. But having this set out at the start of the week and taking your team through that. So at the Lab 17, we're broken down into different squads. So I'll meet with my squad on a Monday afternoon, and we'll go through that. This is great for holding each other accountable, also sharing a bit more context with the rest of the team, and then just calling anything out. You know, so-and-so wants to do outreach for this role. Okay, what does that actually mean? What does good look like? Is this 50 messages that you want to focus on? You know, et cetera, et cetera. But then what we do at the very end of the week is we come together on a Friday morning with the Lab 17 as well, and we go through the impact that we've had for the week, because so many things literally change every day. And that's the only constant thing within the world that we work in. So we get to the end of the week and we reflect back on the goals that we've set, but then we share the impact that we've had. So while they may have changed, we'll go through the good things that have happened and anything that we would have liked to have done differently. And it just means that we round out the week every Friday feeling that we've been that we've accomplished something, or that we've had a good week.
I love that. Goal setting, time management.
Yes.
I guess on there as well, you've said about change, and it's something that we talked about. You guys in talent acquisition, HR, I mean everybody, but particularly you guys, have had to deal with a shed load of change over the last couple of years. What do you think, like, how do you handle that change, or what do you think makes you good at handling that change?
This is something that you just need to practice, I think, over the years, and also just have a word with yourself as well, because I know myself, I love to be in control. And when things happen, for example, yesterday, myself and my colleague over in the US, we've been working with one partner on 3 specific roles over in the US. And then they said, oh yeah, Q1 priorities have changed. We're now looking for these 4 different roles. I'm like, it's the 1st of March. What do you mean Q1? Like, we've only 4 weeks left. We can't completely shift. So it's just about taking that step back. Remember that we're all human at the end of the day, and resetting the goals. I think when this happens, it's so important just to set the expectations with your hiring manager. Take them on that journey, rather than just being an order taker and, yeah, okay, cool, no problem, we'll just change that. And then what's going to happen in 2 weeks' time? They're going to ask, where are these candidates? Are we close to closing any of these roles? I was like, well, no, because it takes us X amount of weeks to get the ad up, start to do our own outreach, benchmark some candidates, push them through to the first stage of the hiring process, etc. So at the beginning, we'll break all of this down. We also have a set date that we anticipate closing the role by, and we'll send updates every week. So if we've got something like this that changes, we reset with the hiring managers and we put that in that role has gone live today. That role didn't go live at the start of the quarter. So it's just over communicating, which I think is something that we sometimes do forget to do because there's so much happening all the time. There's so much changing all the time. But when we over communicate and document, we're setting ourselves up to have the best success. And we just want to get to a point where we never have a hiring manager coming to us and say what's happening with this role or what's happening with this role. We've got the documentation in place so they can self-serve and they can see where those candidates are at themselves, or at least we've got something in the diary where we're able to discuss any specific candidates. And then on the flip side of that, setting those expectations with candidates as well. With so many things happening, sometimes you've got a candidate that's going to a final for a role that's now actually shifted and changing. So again, taking that human approach with your candidates and letting them know we are a fast growing company. Unfortunately, there is a little bit of ambiguity, but that's what it's going to be like if you do join. And we want to make sure that you are comfortable with that as well. So setting that expectation with them. If you're working with a hiring manager who's not going to get back to you probably for a week, let the candidate know that. And don't just say, cool, I'll let you know when I hear back from the hiring manager. Instead, I'm probably not going to catch up with this person until Friday. Let's leave it until Monday at the latest. But either way, I'll check in with you then. I'll give you an update just in terms of where we're at. So yeah, kind of to loop back around, over communicating and documentation are the two things that I swear by.
I think that, and setting expectations. I think you're so right. Having a conversation with someone this morning, like even if you don't have an update, just tell someone you don't have an update and where it's at, and just kind of set expectations when you will, because when people don't know, that's when you kind of, especially interview process, you can go through all sorts of spirals of self-doubt and the rest of it if you just don't know what's going on. Where if you're not going to hear for a week, then that's fine. Like you can just feel a lot more calm about it. I guess going back to what we were talking about before we came on here, and a couple of things that you've touched on there, there's been so much change in the year since we did your podcast to now, just in terms of hiring processes and everything that's going on in terms of talent shortages. What do you think has kind of been, I guess, the key things that have changed for you over the last year, or things that you've had to adapt to over that last year?
I think the biggest thing for me is building rapport with candidates and providing them with an exceptional experience. So what I found recently is maybe 6 or 12 months ago, I had a couple of candidates that might have declined. And that's because I've been working with organizations which are getting bigger and they've got coordinators that are stepping in at some parts of the process that I would have usually owned. So I was chatting with one of my colleagues, Rory, about this a few weeks ago, and we said, we need to start to put back in those checkpoints just to check back with the candidates to make sure all their questions are being answered, they're still engaged. Where else are you interviewing? Reconfirming salary expectations and just going that extra mile to keep them warm as you take them through the process. By doing that, it means we've got a lot more control over the process and the candidates, and it means that we're saving a lot of people a lot of time, rather than the candidate going through the process, you loop back in at the final and they're like, oh, I've actually just accepted an offer somewhere else. So that's been the big one, and just putting those checkpoints in place to have a conversation with them. And speed. One thing that we found at the moment is just speed to get candidates through the process. So one of the things that I think is so important when an organization is about to go through high growth is walking before you run. So putting your processes in place, getting your interview training done and out of the way, implementing your ATS, because as soon as they hit go, which is usually when they get a VC round of funding, that's when the madness begins. And that's when there's that snowball effect from the board to the leadership team, which, funnels down through into the TA team, where people start to panic and now we need all of these. So if you can get all of those in place first and then set those expectations with the candidate that ideally we want this to be a 2-week process. These are the people that you're going to meet. Does that work for you? And ensuring that they're committing to completing the full process and getting them to take responsibility and come back to you and be held accountable to let you know if there's anything else happening, if they're interviewing anywhere else, checking back in, what concerns have you got? Is there anything that you're unsure of? And also just painting a real picture. If they've not worked in a startup or a scale up before, letting them know what that's like and letting them know pretty early on. And we do that really well when the partnerships that we have is with Linktree, and they have questions at the very start of the process about their values to make sure that the candidate is comfortable with those and aligned to them. And one of the questions that we ask in there is, how well do you deal with ambiguity? So we paint the picture and let them know that this is why we're asking you this. Are you actually comfortable with this? And making sure that we're checking in with the candidates at the beginning of the process.
I think that's great. And I think I love the bit about just like kind of defining what that exceptional experience looks like for business and spending the time doing that up front. I guess though, that kind of brings me on to, so you're a small business, you know what it's like. You've got 101 things to do. The to-do list is never going to be done. Where do you think businesses, before they get that funding, like where can they start in trying to work out what that exceptional experience looks like? Because even at that point, right, you don't have data, there's so much you don't know, but you still need to set something up to kind of have a point to iterate from.
I think just doing it by department first. So engineering is my bread and butter and will always be my favorite part of the organization. So I'll take that as an example. So sitting down with your key stakeholder or the hiring managers that you're going to work with at the very beginning, mapping out the interview process and understanding the why behind each of those stages. What happens so frequently when this doesn't happen is X candidate meets with you, Laura, and you take them through kind of a high level interview and you find out some great things about them, but you don't go deep on anything. And then maybe they pass over to me and I do the exact same. And we both love them because it's all been high level. And then the hiring manager interviews them and the same thing happens. And then we hire them and then the cracks start to show 3 to 6 months in. If you map what that looks like at the very beginning, make sure that there's a specific interview for each part of the process. So usually within engineering, recruiter screening call, hiring manager interview, or a peer level interview where we can understand kind of the environment that they've worked in, the culture, the type of work that they like to do, tech stack, etc. And then we go through a functional assessment, which is either a live coding session or a take-home test. And then we'll take them to a final or a functional interview, which goes into that in a little bit more detail. So we're actually validating that they can do what they've just showed us that they can do, but they can communicate about it as well. And then breaking that down and having a structured feedback or evaluation form, which is built out in Lever or Greenhouse or whatever ATS that your company is using. If you're not big enough to have an ATS, having that somewhere so you've got a consistent approach to every candidate. Because naturally as humans, we have this unconscious bias where a candidate might start telling you about a really cool project. And I love that type of project, or I've done something similar in the past. And now all of a sudden I love this candidate and I want to hire them, or I've not actually assessed some really important things. So having consistency in that approach and breaking that down, and then taking the candidate through the process. And what I've seen has worked best is when you bring all interviewers back in at the very end of that process for a 15-minute debrief, as long as it's been mostly yeses and we haven't had to reject the candidate throughout. And then we go through everyone's feedback individually. And what usually happens is this is where the yellow flags start to come up, because people don't want to put yellow flags like, oh, this person was 5 minutes late to an interview. People don't tend to put that in feedback forms because they're trying to be quick in their response and get it in so we can move forward with this candidate. But what we've seen that happens in those debrief conversations is, oh, well, they were actually out walking their dog when I had my interview, where they were 5 minutes late for this one. And then we start to kind of build this case where we can either share that with the candidate and make sure that they've got an explanation around it, or, we decide not to progress. So having all of this structured documented, and not just documenting the ATS, but then having the themes that are involved in each stage of the interview process, the questions that we want to ask, and then the expectations for each level. Mm-hmm. It seems very daunting. It seems like a lot, but once you kind of map this out and break it down against the kind of core criteria that you've got for those roles, you can do it quite quickly. And then taking your team through kind of a 101 interview training, so everyone understands what their role is within the interview process, how important it is to get your feedback in, and what's expected of them as well. So once you get all that done and put in place, you're ready to go. And of course, iterations are going to take place as you go. You'll get feedback from candidates and saying this test was too long or this didn't make sense, and you make those changes as you go. But at least having those foundations in place, because then as you start to hire more and more folks into your team, this is what you're going to be training them up on. So they'll have gone through that experience themselves, and then they're able to learn what that looks like and how to become an effective interviewer very quickly as well.
I love that. It's, I guess it's just taking that time up front, and then it just makes everything else easier. So it feels really time consuming at the start, but you think if you take the time to do that, then how much easier it's going to make all those processes and how much time you're going to save later on. Yes, yeah. It's all just about that planning side. And on that note as well, I have a couple of questions.
I was going to just quickly add to that one. On that note, I think, and I don't know if this is because I come from an agency background, but it's just been ingrained in me somehow that I can't waste hiring managers' time. So a lot of people will just go into that process and just say, yes, we'll do this, and we'll just push candidates through and we'll hope for the best. And then these cracks start to show. I think it's our responsibility as a subject matter expert in the TA space to say, look, this is going to take us a little while at the start. We will get to the hiring piece, but let's just take this first week and get ourselves set up for success, because that's when we can start to move quickly, when we've got these processes in place and we're communicating on a specific cadence, or, if that's a Slack or if it's an email or however you want to do that. But I think, the mistake that a lot of us do tend to make is not doing that up front, and then trying to do that while we've also got 10 roles open with 50 candidates going through the process.
Yeah, it's like you wait for it to become really painful before you do something about it. But at that point, it's even more difficult to fix, right? Because you're having to change that ingrained behavior. I think I mentioned to you just before, I've just started a role at BizPay, and it's the first time I've ever been in a business where we got hiring manager training. I've never had that. I've hired so many people over the last however many years. I know, it was mind blown. I was like, and genuinely sat out a process, and we got documents afterwards. Yeah, mind blowing, but amazing, right? I had two questions from what you've just said as well that kind of link to it. Who do you think is doing a really great job of creating that awesome candidate experience and setting expectations? Is there someone that we can all look to and be like, yeah, those guys have nailed it?
That's a good question, because, and I honestly don't know the answer to that, and I'll tell you why.
Yeah.
You've got the larger organizations, your Atlassians, your Googles, your Facebook, that are so big and they've such a strong brand and market. So when they segment and break down their interview process, there's different parts of the talent team that are looking after candidates at different stages. So there is somewhat of a disconnect with that candidate experience. And then you've got the smaller startups that are very time poor, and they're trying to manage a lot of candidates at the same time. I work with some fabulous companies. We work with Linktree and Immutable, where we're a part of their TA team as well. And that is something that they're very focused on now, and making sure that they've got a really strong candidate experience throughout, because they understand how important that is for their brand in market. So we've got things in place where if a candidate applies, they need to hear back from us within 3 days. And that's non-negotiable. And we share some feedback with them as to why they weren't successful. We also make sure that we're very conscious of the time to hire, and making sure that candidates aren't sitting there for too long as well. So there's a lot of KPIs that we have in place around this. Also sending out feedback forms to understand the candidate's experience and try to make any changes. as well. So I think it is really difficult because larger companies are too large to have kind of that one person taking you through the whole process. But then the smaller companies, they're still learning, and they're trying to put all these processes in place as they go through all these rounds of funding.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of why I asked, because I think when we talk about recruitment marketing, like I've done a bunch of research recently on like career sites and who's doing a really good job of that. Because even setting out expectations on your career site to say, this is our interview process, here's our FAQs, you know, things like that. But even that, it's that's kind of external facing and isn't always actually what you get. Great, the lights have gone off again.
Not used to working in an office.
Oh, I know. Tell me about it. So yeah, so I think it's just that kind of external to internal. But that was my second question. You just touched on it. So I was actually talking to a friend this morning just around really shitty experiences when you're going through interview processes, right? For these brands or companies you really want to work for, and you're in this process and it sucks. But people don't often ask the candidate if you didn't get the role. Nobody often asks, you know, what did you think? You know, what's your perception? Because so much about that affects your brand and, you know, talent pooling and a whole bunch of other stuff that we could touch on, but we don't have time for. But you've just mentioned feedback forms there. So I'd love to hear how you guys have been using feedback forms and how you think you can integrate that so there is more of a feedback loop and it feels a bit more of a two-way value exchange as you go through.
So there are some ATSs that do that automatically. I absolutely love Lever. And when a candidate gets closed out, depending on what stage they've gotten to, it will automatically send that. I think we also have responsibility as a TA to ask candidates that as well. It happens so often that we'll reject a candidate and we give them a call and we have to share the news with them, but we haven't asked them for their feedback. Or if we do, we don't have a very effective loop on how we bring this back into the interview process, because what will happen is there's obviously been a disagreement between what the hiring manager wants and what the candidate thinks like their strengths are. So when the candidate says, well, I don't agree with you doing X, Y, Z, well, then naturally we'll think, well, they're obviously annoyed because I didn't get the job. I think we can do a better job of this and having specific questions rather than something open-ended. You know, I want to hear your feedback as well. Well, I think this, this, and this, rather than that saying, well, what did you think about this? What did you think about this? You know, what's your feedback on the actual structure? Do you think that it was timely? How would you rate your TA and how responsive they were to you? You know, do you believe that you were set up for success to go through this interview process? So there's a combination there. A lot of people, if they do get rejected, they're not going to bother filling out a feedback form. So I think bringing that onus back onto the TA and having a consistent approach and then documenting that or recording that somewhere. I don't think there's anywhere like within an ATS that records that very well. You'd kind of have to do like manually create a template to fill in that form and then make sure every TA is responsible for doing that to collect some specific feedback that you can then take back to the hiring process. Because I think a lot of it is just, well, I think this, or I've heard this, or we can look at the data. But again, the data in an ATS is maybe 90% accurate because not everyone puts in information as they should.
Yeah, and I guess you're right. It's about the questions asked. I do think there must be something in there. Maybe we need to dig into it separately, just around how people leave that process feeling about the brand. Like we talk about employer brand so much, we do so much, we invest so much in it. Like it's, you know, yeah, okay, maybe they're not super happy that they didn't get the job, but they'll still go away with a perception of how they feel about you and the company, right? It's I think it's a super interesting one. Probably relevant because I was talking about it this morning, but that's awesome. Thank you so much for today. I've loved it. There's 100 more questions I could ask you, but really appreciate your time. So thank you.
Yeah, you too. It was great chatting with you again.